So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our seminar, Horizon 2055. And I am very happy and excited to introduce to you Taryn Jade. She's a Gqeberha-based South African multimedia artist. And what she does is she uses kind of creative production and installation to explore philosophical complexities. So in her previous work, she has looked at materialist philosophy relating to consciousness, thingness, post-humanism, ecofeminism, so very broad base. And she's currently now working on an MA in visual art at Nelson Mandela University and under the chair. And in this seminar, she's going to explore her process of responding to dereliction in contemporary Gqeberha while engaging with the complexity of nihilism, which is very, I think, very crucial and important if we start thinking about the future. So in discussing her art process in relation to this topic, she's going to share how she's kind of threading together all these intricate strands of context and meaning making, rubble, remnants, and she says knitting. So with that, Taryn, welcome. Lovely to see you. Lovely to have you present for us, and over to you.
Okay. So yeah, hello everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope the flu season has not attacked you to the same extent as it attacked me. I also want to extend my thanks to the ISCIA team for inviting me to speak. It's an interesting exercise. You catch me in a phase of building towards my paper hand-in this December and my exhibition in January. So this talk is not a reflection on what has already been made in complete finality, but instead an articulation of the context I'm looking at, the concepts influencing my understanding, and where I am in the process of making. My paper has been about exploring the applicability of the word dereliction and the concept of nihilism to contemporary Gqeberha. A core question for me has been, what art can I make in response to this? I have looked at a landscape of somethings, including that which we might see as meaning nothing. I have looked at a framework of self in relation to nothingness in meaning, and I have made some things along the way. To save time and space in my slides, I thought I'd just mention that unless cited or book covers, all photos and artworks in this presentation are by me. To begin, I thought it might be helpful to give some context for me as an artist in the broad base I've worked in. I primarily work with sculpture and installation to explore concepts with drawing, collage, and writing as tools for processing ideas and information. My starting point with exhibited work was art experience with the materiality of consciousness, understood through my experience of temporal lobe epilepsy and brain damage. So these are some excerpts from the temporal installation, which was exhibited at the recently relocated Artec Gallery. This was in 2022. In more recent work preceding this research, I explored concepts of vital materialism or new materialism within the context of the urban landscape, in reference to discourse concerning the Anthropocene. I sought to trace an intuitive connection with materials shaped by the dominance of human development, the uncomfortable side of human comfort. I explored my response to the presence of the human made in the world and how it can respond to me inside art making. On the left is Man-Made Malignance, a large sculpture communicating my feelings in response to vast swathes of concrete occupying our world. On the right is Bedrock Burden, an installation that was accompanied by a soundscape of concrete curing. The current research began last year with a fascination with materiality as a sculptor and installation artist. It began with the sensation of seeing what is built around me, of it changing, evolving, deteriorating. I was looking at Gqeberha's urban landscape and considering how it responds to and behaves with the people inside of it. I picked up pieces of road from abandoned rubble piles and potholes and noticed the cracks in disheveled walls that look out onto our city. While I began with a feeling of attachment to my built environment, over time it became harder to ignore how many corners of the city are depreciating, empty, abandoned, how many are derelict. The term derelict has multiple meanings, all of which refer back to being defined as abandoned. It was first used as a noun referring to an abandoned property in 1660, previously used about sea vessels abandoned at sea or stranded on shore in the 1640s. Dereliction functions both as a physical descriptor and a marker of tone, shaping how the material or functional nature of something described as that is perceived. At times, derelict implies that which has been abandoned should not have been. At other times, it carries a tone of resentment that what is derelict continues to exist. I found three useful ways the term can be applied in unpacking its relevance to Gqeberha: derelict buildings, derelict people, and dereliction of duty. Derelict building refers to an abandoned building, not one that is left locked while someone is traveling, but one neglected long enough to take on the aesthetic of dereliction. On a side note, something I found interesting is the etymology of building as a word. We refer to places not as the built, but as the building, something that must be maintained. It's a continuum, continually built. Note as well that its root word is the same as that of being. Derelict person refers to a homeless person, usually with the implication that they have abandoned society or themselves. Historically, it's been used derogatively as a synonym for words like vagrant or bum. This is an interesting space to look at because on the one hand, there is autonomy in every individual. On the other, when one falls into or is born into difficult circumstances, the availability of social safety nets is a massive contributor to whether or not a person abandons hope in themselves. In this context, there is an affecting relationship between people and their community infrastructure. It is interesting to ask who is the abandoner in the relationship if you see someone as derelict. Dereliction of duty is a labor law term for a justification for dismissal, referring to when a party knows that they have a job to do, it would have consequences if not done, and still does not do it. It applies in both the private and public sectors. I found this useful as a mechanism to discuss issues of corruption and mismanagement in our municipality. It is not all who work within it, as with any context, but there is a structural issue, a culture of not seeing duty to the people as sufficient purpose to deliver actions in positions of power with integrity. But I might be getting ahead of myself. So let's talk about Gqeberha for those unfamiliar with its historical context. So it's the largest city in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. It's my hometown and Port Elizabeth. Gqeberha was, inverted commas, officially established in 1820 as a British colonial settlement on the outer eastern border of the then Cape Colony. Occupied by Amaxhosa, Gunaka, Khoi, San, and Gqeberha groups. Please excuse my pronunciation. Following the establishment of South Africa as a republic and the span of the apartheid regime, our first democratic election took place in 1994, 2 years before I was born. The region historically was a key area in industrial and wool product export with our bay and harbour. It is also home to construction-related and automobile manufacture as big contributors to our economic output today. So I began this research 30 years into democratic South Africa, inside the remains of generations that were here before, looking at interlaced, overlapping, yet to be worn paths in front of, beside, and behind mine. Contemporary South Africa faces multiple long-term ramifications of segregationist policies stemming from its colonial and apartheid past, which some phrase as internal colonization. A geographical example of this includes the maintained distinction between Gqeberha and Ibai on maps of the region, as you can see in this slide. While the names of the areas have been changed, the circumstances of inequity and social fragmentation between them have not been adequately improved. One articulation of this lack of improvement in visual art was explored in Wandile Msipa's response to George Pember's famous 1948 painting, No Work. That painting depicts a young man coming to the city to seek opportunity, but being excluded from the economy in early official apartheid. Msipa in 2023 portrayed a similar young man, this time in democratic South Africa, wearing a graduation cap and still unable to find financial security in the city. This painting is titled, Still No Work. Issues manifest in South Africa's urban environments, including Gqeberha as urban decay, homelessness, and economic inequality. All of these contribute to exacerbating the social fragmentation produced by colonial history, leaving many Gqeberha residents without a sense of community and a lack of trust in the systems of ethics present here. Over here is a mural by Beef 37, playfully depicting Gqeberha as a sunny and glamorous coastal city, painted on a derelict building in Military Road in central Gqeberha. Another visual dynamic of speaking about our city is the Instagram page, Shitty City PE. I hope I'm allowed to say it in this context. With a devoted anonymous admin constantly uploading images of Gqeberha architecture, wrapped in the making of a paradox in its bio, chronicles of a shitty, always gritty city we call home, Port Elizabeth. I think these are very interesting examples of local artists using a narrative of Gqeberha being an ugly place humorously, even lovingly, in the case of the Instagram page. So one of the larger artworks I'm currently working on is a monument to systems of authority, morality, and service delivery that are struggling to serve the majority of South Africans. I'm using the suit motif because I associate it with the modernist ideals, or as Gqeberha in the Ethics of Ambiguity would phrase it, the ideals of the serious man, those with a reverence towards hierarchy, the highway, the productive empire. It is also a suit of duty, ill-fitting in the contemporary context of mismanagement. I've used steel and wire to make an armature and ceramics to fill in the space. The construction of the sculpture is accepting of its inevitable deterioration. It is currently in the process of being mounted on a large plinth, which I am making from mild steel, predominantly recycled. You might notice that the plinth design is reminiscent of the Camp Nou on our coastline, with decoration based on the outline of Settlers Highway. The historically idealized constructions, figuratively, are falling apart. This work is trying to visually articulate the experience of witnessing that. The piece is planned to be tall and inaccessible, communicating the sensation in South Africa of authority being out of reach and of people feeling unable to affect how our market-based economy and democracy looks after the needs of the people. When I began fixating on the word derelict, which can refer to a space, a person, or a duty that has been abandoned, a narrative of disillusionment, apathy, and cynicism in our news, politics, and even casual coffee conversations began to all feel linked together. There's a poem by Dola Sepeta, a painter from New Brighton, that has been stuck in my head throughout this. It is titled My Town. I'll just read you an excerpt. I want to lose this disappointed town, with the broken face that stands for everything rotten, a forgery with no soul on its way, an intruder with no logic proportion, with no color of conscience, or even a muted reason, an incomplete image shaped out of twisted existence. The poem speaks to the experience of feeling pointlessness in trying to find an individual logic for good, when all the systems are seen as fallacies, the structures lack integrity, and people are repeatedly disappointed when they approach experience with ambition, hope, or caring. In the introduction of State Capture in South Africa 2023 book, Buthelezi and Vale reference a description of modern tragedy as the loss of hope, the slowly settling loss of any acceptable future, as an allegory for the social experience of disillusionment of many contemporary South Africans. The loss of hope in South Africa manifests as disengagement from social or civil responsibility, abandonment of productive spaces, and acceptance of corruption and mismanagement as normality. A few times in the seminar series, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich has come up. It actually helped me a lot. It helped me to see a correlation between this work and that of one of the artists I speak about in my paper, Fred Page. Friedrich was a romantic landscape painter in the early 19th century Germany. Fred Page was an artist who lived in and looked at Gqeberha from 1947 to his death in 1982. Page's paintings had surrealistic stylistic themes, and consistently used imagery of the Gqeberha landscape, its people, and its own iconography of memory and experience. So have a look at Page's work. Page's observer is not in the position of traveling, clothed in the becomings of the European wanderer next to it. Instead, the figure is staying in the city, stripped of clothing, of skin, of eyes, leaving only a red man in shoes. The shoes are formal, reminiscent of 19th century aristocratic European men, strengthening the likelihood that Page was aware of the German reference. The chasm his figure looks out at is not a valley with whispers of clouds floating over it. Instead, it is a black pit, foregrounded by a concrete walkway and surrounded by grey hills that seem cut into by a building apparatus. The figure in Page's painting is not standing with his back to the viewer. We are not positioned as being with him, safe in not being seen by him. Instead, the viewer is in his peripheral vision. He is not a leader guiding us into the potential of our imagination. He is just another person looking at what is in front of us both. I bring this up because my work has been less about the horizon we walk towards and more about the pebbles in our shoes, slowing our progression. Part of the horizon is the landscape we are walking through. We cannot run from the world that already is, and we should not hide from responsibility within that. To pivot more into the theory side of things, Arthur C. Danto in After the End of Art, so this was a 97 book, explains that the theoretical movements of art in the 60s and 70s pressed against boundary after boundary and found that the boundaries all gave way, bringing forward the question of what art itself is. In his view, conceptual art demonstrated that they need not be a palpable visual object for something to be a work of visual art. You had, in brief, to turn to philosophy. Coincidingly, Mary Midgley in Philosophical Plumbing in 92 argues that poetry and other arts are essential in philosophy to identify problems, brainstorm solutions, and interpret or disseminate ideas, in and amongst her other arguments. These two authors' logics are what I've been pulling from in my research process of involving the fields of art and philosophy with each other. So in order to keep making the something of communicating my process, let's talk about the ideology of nothing. But first, I want to show you a stop motion video I made while researching this section. I hope it plays. So nihilism as a concept has a tumultuous history in philosophical discourse, with considerable dispute over its exact definition, application, and consequences. For efficiency, it's fair to phrase nihilism as a philosophical stance, whether cultural or ontological, according to which transcendental meaning or moral truth does not exist. Nihilism is not a physical phenomenon, but a philosophical experience. It is an individual seeing, however incrementally, that systems of meaning, morality, truth, or social norms are constructed by humans in response to phenomenological information. So the stop motion video I made is titled Light at the End. It's a loop of a passage that the viewer moves through. The passage dissolves and reconfigures. Often inside experiences of existential dread or concern for constructions, we might focus on the walls, on the passage, where I think the truth of defining what meaningless means, the somethinghood inside this nothingness, lies in the steps taken and the tone in which the passage is viewed. I forced the viewer here to move through the passage quickly, but I could just as well have had them stand still or wonder, which I hope can be understood in critical viewing. In philosophy, the problem with nihilism is not often found in its logic. Nothing being found when transcendental meaning is sought is difficult to dispute, but nihilism is often shoved aside as that which should not be engaged with critically. I believe nihilism is not a logical fallacy. The problem lies in the consequences of this logic, in how people respond to its conclusions. For context for how this is not just existential rumination, the writing of Nietzsche, the most prominent scholar of nihilism, was largely exploring a social application of philosophy. He had the famous proclamation in The Gay Science that God is dead. He was writing in late 1800s Germany, a time of the Second Industrial Revolution, post-Enlightenment, and post-Romanticism in art. Christianity had a huge influence on their society, and politics were dense between the church and state in that stage of the German Empire. But changes and critical thinking had begun to unravel answers to questions of transcendental meaning or ultimate morality in that culture. Nietzsche's discussion of God is dead was not only about religion. Contextually, it was about social systems of meaning and morality. He warned against creating new gods, new systems for all to subscribe to in the absence of the old, when there is no one way for humanity to find true meaning. For Nietzsche, in Genealogy of Morals, he expresses that the loss of these ideals, such as truth or God or the realization that they never really existed, is not merely destructive. It creates a space to build values anew. In other words, nihilism is a moment of crisis, an experience of crisis, but also a potential starting point for creativity. When we apply this conversation of nihilism to social narratives in post-liberation South Africa, its validity of application becomes even clearer. I argue in my paper that our condition is not distant from what Fanon warned against in The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon projected that if the nationalist elite simply inherit colonial power, as opposed to continuing the decolonial project as he envisaged, liberation turns hollow. Post-94 South Africa is an interesting case study of this. A national bourgeoisie has emerged. Capitalism primarily remains structurally untouched, and revolutionary hopes are replaced by consumer aspirations. Manifest as a moral vacuum in which, the result can manifest as a moral vacuum in which resistance and struggle becomes memory, and the present lacks grounding principles beyond just not being apartheid. Of course, there are post-liberation efforts to ground the constitutional democracy in a system of ethics, the Constitution itself, the iconography of Nelson Mandela, and systems of accepting diversity and perspectives in the South African populace in our three-tier republic and parliamentary system. However, issues of corruption, ill resolution of structural inequality, and avoidance of accountability by government officials and private capital elites creates a narrative of deep distrust in the public. This post-liberation nihilism emerges when critique outpaces construction, when resistance defines itself in opposition to the past or to others coinciding in the experience of the present, and when liberation becomes a symbol rather than a material transformation. This void, while perilous, may also be a necessary threshold towards an unfinished decolonial future. Responses to the realization that There is no one ultimate truth, one rule for meaning or morality are widely varied. Ethics can become ambiguous depending on individual decisions made in complex scenarios. I found it helpful to categorize what different writers describe as responses to nihilism. From their descriptions of nihilistic behaviors, I have identified two axes: passive versus active, drawn from Nietzsche's Will to Power, and pessimistic versus optimistic, drawn from the writing of Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, and Norman Goetz. Passive pessimistic nihilism is the cynical nihilist, the narrative of nothing will ever get better, coping by ignoring your potential responsibility. Passive optimistic nihilism is the happy nihilist, accepting meaninglessness and focusing on finding beauty in your own life, whether through meditation or enjoying the enormity of the galaxy as an individual. Active pessimistic nihilism is the one that everyone fears, a radical presentation of there being no reason to live, or, as de Beauvoir brought up, of seeking power while assuming that everyone else would abandon ethics if they had the chance, so one might as well. I see the ideal response to nihilism as active optimism, accepting that the world will not give you joy, but taking responsibility for looking after your own meaning and that of others. It can be an iteration of a guru or of existentialism. I am not free until we all are, and that has to be treated as possible. One can see no higher meaning and still be capable of caring for community, creatively handling the experience of life, and bearing responsibility for one's actions. I do not assert that people are always in one category. In my own life, in my own art making, in my own attempt to articulate these ideas, I have found these categories useful in explaining differences in theories or artworks. But in the passage of life, we move between different responses to meaninglessness. A series I've been working on, touching on the concept of dereliction in people, as discussed earlier, and the complexities of human context and biases, has the pencil title Mourning Doves. I find pigeons to be a helpful metaphor for South Africans in struggling cities. People move towards them for opportunities, much like the urbanized pigeons. Some thrive in the environment. Some are welcomed into pigeon lovers' yards. That's the pigeons, not the people. Others are seen as pests, inconveniences, competitors. I see pigeons as something that can be met with love and care if approached with an open mind, but often they are met with cynicism and apathy. It's the kind of bias we need to check in with inside ourselves when feeling frustrated with the needs of others in our community, or overwhelmed by how difficult it feels to be good for society. The music group I was commissioned by Gqeberha Boiling Point is the firmest assertion of active optimistic nihilism in the arts that I've found in local creatives so far, in my opinion. Their single from the album Humanize is about Gqeberha. I made this print of the manganese port on our harbor forward. Contextually, the band is in the genre of hardcore influenced by death metal. This area of music engages with the overlap of politics and philosophy, articulating, processing, and cathartically sharing experiences of anger. The single is a warning. The city is dying, but it's not dead. The lyrics written by vocalist Dominic Lowe speak to not disregarding the potential of the people, or not ignoring the difficulty we find ourselves in. It is not easy to resolve narratives of nothingness or despair in Gqeberha, but that does not mean one should abandon the responsibility to do so. As he says, struggle breeds strength, and while there shall be more struggles, the will has to be maintained. To be a bit vulnerable here, this research project has been a confrontation with ideas I had, but was afraid to think through. I did not want to panic or allow my own depression to take over while engaging with ideas I find difficult to handle. I'm sure there are people who might find it easier and people who would find it impossible to spend this much time trying to visually articulate nihilism and dereliction. Alongside this, the experience has not taken place in a vacuum. Local and global politics have been playing out, wars have begun and been sustained. My family and friends have had trials and tribulations, but I could not abandon what I had already accepted I would try to understand. At times, I could not face going into the studio. At times, I could not face my writing and reading, but I decided to choose a project to maintain throughout the research, even when it felt too difficult to engage with the rest. Inside this process, I learned to knit and crochet. It was something I could do when nothing else felt possible. From late November 2024, I've been making strands in different wool, different moods, and different patterns. Knitting has a history, not only with wool being a prime export of Gqeberha, but also as a part of women's meaning making and coping in the face of loss, grief, and addiction. In the article, Knitting as a Remedy, Women's Everyday Creativity in Response to Hopelessness and Despair, Marta Cargo outlines case studies of women and artists who use knitting as a meditation or a coping mechanism, and articulates that they later can ascribe a symbolic or mystic value to their creation. In my own practice, the meditation or distraction I found in making was the highest value I found. The installation I am making, of my making, articulates an intimate tension I feel between passivity and activity, pessimism and optimism in the face of nihilism. Sometimes I only did it when I was not brave enough to articulate my thoughts in direct subject matter. I hid and made something to distract myself from melancholy. At other times, the practice meant something different, an active meditation, tying knots over and over and over, considering what I had read, thinking about my thinking, listening to my hands and my intuition, considering paths forward. Throughout my practice of knotting over nothingness, I found many little somethings, moments of joy, excitement, and affirmation in actually looking at what I had made. I also ran into the difficulty over and over of realizing the problem is massive and I am only one set of hands. I will never regret this research, but at times I know that I have just been staring at walls of the passage, not knowing why I am walking or not wanting to walk much further. So in the slide, I have a poem I wrote late one night after knitting. Next to it, I have a quilt I've been making from abandoned rubble and pothole around our cities that I was collecting right at the beginning. And I've been constantly running into logistical problems of it falling apart and problems I'm still trying to solve. Let me read you that excerpt. I'm back in the corner, knitting and knotting. I'd take it over more bed rotting, aching and staring at our effigy, weaving into a legacy of seeking warm places. I'm not the most convincing into my love's existence, not beyond, but in morning's wincing. Sometimes I miss not caring. Tonight I cried again for the gap I feel between what should be done and what I am doing. My work became more active in my eyes when, in the wool work, I decided I wanted to make as many strands as possible. I commissioned both friends and family to assist. This led to a shared space with people I care about. It led me to see the knots as not only a meditation on one path, but on the over 1 million paths of Gqeberha residents that compose the he actually means. I was no longer running from pessimistic thoughts. I was holding space for them, while also looking towards optimistic ones. I was no longer keeping to my own space and mind, creating with and around others. I think that's the long and short of my practice in this research. I think that I'm finding that it is okay to care. Purpose, belonging, and community are very important to people, not abandoning what has already been made, but instead reinscribing what they value into its meaning. We cannot be scared of not finding the perfect solution or the optimal answer. We have to inhabit the freedom of our wills and the responsibility to others in how we enact that power. So I've spent a lot of time with nothingness, only to find many somethings within it, not least of which is a caring for our city and a genuine hope towards the future of everyone who does and will inhabit it. I think optimism is a fragile but important aspect of how to look at the world. And I hope that not ignoring the pool of pessimism in art can strengthen its resilience in viewers. Thank you.
Taryn, thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, lots of questions and comments that I have. I'm going
I
to
can't
again,
answer.
I'm going to kind of let other people speak first if they want to. So if you want to sort of comment or raise questions, just pop your hand up or say something in the chat, and we'll kind of get to you. So while you're gathering your thoughts, one of the things I think was absolutely I found really that I really kind of resonated with was depression. And that sense of, well, I think knitting, not only knitting, planting, there are all those, and that seems to be a very kind of conventional wisdom through the ages, maybe even a feminine wisdom, I'm not sure, but that somehow in those little acts you kind of hold it together. And that's where you find the sense of being. And I find that interesting. I don't know if that's a feminine thing. I mean, I'd just like you to chat a little more about that. Because I'm with you completely on that. And it was actually my mother who, at some point, I had this terrible kind of post-COVID anxiety thing that happened. And the first thing my mother said was, okay, we're going to go and get wool and you're going to knit. And so I knitted a lot. And it really is something it's a strange kind of activity. So is that how we knit our way into the future?
Well, I think, I guess, so knitting has quite a long history of, in the feminine context, of feeling out of control of other things, but doing something helpful, productive, and meditative in your own life to fuel that availability for other things, for holding yourself together. And alongside that, it's not just a colloquial wisdom thing. It's a practice in things like occupational therapy, where assisting people with coping is creating things that you can see, that you know that you made it. And I think art practice is different to everyone, but I think that's something that's been intrinsic in it for me always, is that it's like, whether or not my art is ever viewed as helpful to others, I know that I will always make because I kind of need to. And I think there's articulations of that in everyone's lives, and aspects that you can tap into, of small things that you can do to help yourself and to help your environment, or to full time to help you feel better. So yeah, it's a wisdom and a nugget that motivates many things and can be used in individual capacities. Yeah. And yeah, and then it's like with bringing in, it's like stuff of knitting the parts into horizons. It's, I of the importance of community as well in that kind of meditation, that it's okay to be sinking into yourself, but there's also space that we should hold for hearing how other people are coping with this world and with moving forward. And that's an important piece of the puzzle in moving towards the future.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can I looking for hands?
I'll go. Oh no, after Gary.
Okay, who? Em, maybe you go first.
Gary, you go. I'll go.
Okay, Gary.
Taryn,
Go,
how's
Gary.
it? Thanks. Thanks for that. That was fantastic. I love the animation and the pictures and the photographs. I was just wondering, I mean, unfortunately, I had some builders in the background from a neighbor, but just on the nihilism bit, the one thing that interests me in terms of climate stuff is hope. Whether it's so there's this thing about hope is not a strategy. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the role of hope in this process. Is it a counter to nihilism? Is it an essential? Is it an innate human quality? You know, did anything strike you in terms of hope during this process?
Yeah, I guess hope is quite a loaded term. I think hope is a little on the passive side of things. So I think the better word is optimism. It's like we can run into things of there's no point in doing something if we feel like it's going to fail anyway. But it will definitely not work if it's not done at all, because there's a pessimistic narrative in it, or there is a hopeless disregard of its potential. So so I understand the thing of like hope is not a strategy, but also I believe that if finding ways to articulate or find optimism in participating in what you want to assist or help with is quite an important aspect of it. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or if I just spoke in a circle.
No, I mean it's a thing that I struggle with continuously. Whether hope is so I mean I agree that it's not a strategy per se, but I'm not sure that you embark on any of this work without some kind of hope that it's going to have a positive, some kind of impact, you know, even if it's a small impact that you, you know, so I've been struggling with that in my own head. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it alone, it makes sense that it is not it's not helpful for strategizing, but hopelessness also is definitely not helpful for strategizing. Put it that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point. Yeah. And I think that that's the problem with nihilism, is that a lot of people tend towards hopelessness as a consequence of it, you know. Yeah, but thanks.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the important thing, is that like there not being something that's going to be provided for you as the reason for doing things, or the higher meaning, or the higher, you know, for being and for doing, doesn't mean you can't. Or it doesn't mean you can't have optimism, and it doesn't mean that this life doesn't matter to the experience of lives around it, or the further experience of this life until it's not there anymore, you know.
Just Emma, just before you come in there, can I just jump in and maybe just refer to Sisyphus? I mean, there is no hope, and there's no belief that things are going to get better. You roll the stone up to the top of the hill, and once it's up there, you get knocked down again. And you roll it up again, and once it's up on the top of the hill, you get knocked down again, and that's your life. And there's no hope in it at all. But there's a sense of courage and meaning in rolling it up, no matter what. And sometimes I feel like that, that there's, you do what you do for its own sake. And there's, even if, and even knowing on top of the hill, you're going to get splattered and it's going to come down again. I don't know. So I'm not sure about this hope thing. I think that it's potentially maybe a little bit dangerous. Maybe you must just do in the absence of hope, which is absurd. But that's the whole point of the. Well, in any case, the point of the myth is it's in the doing that you find some sense of meaning, not in the hope for any future for humanity.
Yeah, but and if I may respond, I mean, you know, you get involved in this stuff because of the consequence of our actions, but to be able to do something effectively, you have to detach yourself from the consequence of your action, in the sense that you have to do, you know. So are you doing that? Is Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill in an act of faith, in the sense that at some point it's going to have a positive impact, or
No,
is he just doing it because he does it?
he's doing it because that's what he has to do. And
Yeah.
there's no sense in which this has any meaning. It's no sense in which this has any consequence. And there's no hope for something different. You're just doing it, and the sense of it, or the meaning of it, if you can call it that, is in its absurdity. You are doing in the face of the absurd. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying I can completely subscribe to that.
I guess if I could push back on that slightly, is because it's one thing speaking about a myth, and it's another thing speaking about the world and life and consequences. Because it's like, yes, Sisyphus, it is absurd that he's pushing it up the hill, but it's not absurd for people to care about their society and their city, even if their efforts are not successful. It's like, it may be absurd, but you will not know it is absurd until it is done. And you're not in the same position of, you have the same rock and the same hill. By the time you know that it's not going to work, it's a different hill and a different rock, and you've got to adapt on how to get it up there. You know, so that's also something to consider.
Yeah. No, nice, good answer. Emma, and then Vulindlela has his hand up, so maybe once after Emma, we'll jump to Vulindlela.
Okie dokie. Thanks so much, Taryn. I really appreciate your work and your perspective. Thank you for sharing that with us today. I don't really have much of a comment, as more of a feeling, which is because I've never read into nihilism from a philosophical level, so I'm really quite naive about it. But it felt like when you talked about nihilism, there was this undercurrent of there needs to be meaning. Like, it seems inherent within the nihilistic approach that there must be meaning and purpose, otherwise what? But then that draws me to my leanings towards Zen Buddhism, and entirely within the sort of Zen tradition is very much trying to get away from the striving for an outcome or for purpose or for meaning, and settling into the present moment. But on this land where I'm working, I feel constantly like, why am I doing this? What am I doing it for? But it's not a sense of what will the outcome be. It's more of a questioning of, is this, I have to act and I'm forced to act, and I would much rather just sit and be non-interventionist entirely and not move. In fact, I'm going to go do that for 10 days on Wednesday for this very reason. But the idea is that for me, at least on this land or in my life, I have great love for this planet and for life. And I don't have any hope for the future changing in a positive way, but it doesn't detract from my love for the process of doing what feels in my body, what makes sense. So I'm not really making any sense, I don't think. I'm thinking out loud, but I wonder if there's any links between the notion of, like, if we shouldn't reconsider whether or not meaning and purpose is already a trap, and there are other ways to experience the world beneath a focus on meaning and purpose all the time and change. There are other perspectives in the world that suggest that that's actually part of the mental trap of humanity. I don't really know what I'm saying, but it's so I guess my question, Taryn, would be, do you see any links between would you find any comfort in the idea that meaninglessness and purposelessness is actually a beautiful thing in some ways?
Yes. I guess
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Okay, so there was one thing. The one book I was bringing up, Nihilism by Nolan Gertz. It's a 2019 book, so that's been quite nice to read because it's been in the context of speaking about contemporary society. It's in the American context, so it's not exactly our experience, but talking about nihilism and meaninglessness in that way was really helpful. And in one of the sections, he speaks about he actually makes the argument that some people associate nihilism with pessimism, but it's actually an optimistic place, and that's kind of what you were saying.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's a disappointed optimism because it's like the experience of feeling that there's no higher purpose and needing to have some kind of response to that is a place of needing the purpose in the first place, which might not be every person's experience or every person's attitude. And it's also quite interesting because there are quite a few papers that speak about Zen Buddhism and the correlations between it and nihilist literature. And so it's like unpacking the terminology doesn't take away from the thing you was that I agreed with you about, that it's like there doesn't have to be a higher meaning or a purpose to be existing. And I think it's healthy to accept that. And there's going to be many different articulations of how people navigate that, whether it is completely retreating and sitting still, whether it is doom scrolling, whether it is running to the desert and taking off their clothes, or whether it is, hey, I want to start a knitting circle in my community. You know, there's lots of different ways of responding to that experience.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Taryn. Vulindlela, let's have you, and then Gary.
Hi. Yes, sorry.
Hi.
Good. Hey, Taryn, sorry I missed your a little bit of your presentation because I was away. I'm on sabbatical, but you and I do speak. For those of you who don't know, Taryn and I and Andrew have been working very closely with this this subject. But I'm enjoying this conversation, this part of the conversation, because I'm interested in the connection between maybe a little bit of what Emma was talking about, this idea of contentment and the futility, and it's sort of like what do we do as human beings around contentment? And I've separated the sense of what I mean by contentment in terms of along the lines of Sisyphean thinking, striving and thriving. And again, I come back to my nature aspect, and I think that when we think about human beings, humanity, there's kind of this built-in measure to strive. We strive and we're wired to just keep going against all odds. Whereas I maybe think to myself about nature and it's thriving. And I draw again distinction between the two things, and that there's maybe a consciousness and an awareness around what we are striving for. And whereas nature's thriving has a kind of a consciousness around just being. And in being, nature just thrives. But however, we have the space of like, we sit within an awareness state, a consciousness state of every day something's going to cost more. Every day something is going to be in disrepair. Everything's, we know what could be. But then we're also building into our systems of understanding these processes of lack. So and on one hand, it's a survival technique. If we sit we become like those beautiful ones, the experiment with the mice that sit up in a very comfortable position and don't do anything once they've achieved their state of perfection. But so maybe our need to keep trying to do better is part of the thriving natural thing. But I'm also interested in this thing of where we build in mechanisms like speculation, financial speculation, our decay of our cities, the growth of our cities, conurbations growing, and resources being needed, and more and more and more being needed, and how that injects into our sense of nihilism, our sense of that we have no control of this. So I don't know if I'm asking a question here, but I'm at this kind of like talking point around this sense of lack. I look around and nature doesn't need, but human beings have kind of like constantly needed, and I don't understand why. So that's if you could comment on that.
Okay. I think I might disagree.
Okay.
But with nuance. I guess with the idea of striving and thriving, that we need more, and yeah, I get the sense that you're describing greed maybe more than need, because nature definitely does have need and can be quite volatile in how it seizes its survival over another's survival. So I'd be careful. Yeah, I think yeah, it's a challenging analogy of like what's the difference between us and nature in that. But the other thing I wanted to maybe mention is like contentment on the one hand can be a productive thing to aim for communities to feel in happiness with what you have and what you are capable of, and like, you know, cook with what's in the pantry, you don't need to go to the shops, kind of thing. But simultaneously, I think it can be a very precarious way of thinking, because you know, if you're in a position of power and the people that you lead or are looking after are struggling with issues of hunger and homelessness and education and their children and their water, and you are in a position to participate in that, you know, that's a very different context for someone to be saying, I wish society was more content. I'm content. I can be content. You know, so it feels like quite a loaded place to break down.
Okay, great. I'm sorry to jump in, but we are edging towards the end of time, and there are two people that still want to kind of sort of jump in on the conversation, which is great. So Gary, I know you had your hand up first, so quickly, and then we'll chat to Tessa.
Or let Tessa go first because I've spoken. So I'll come back in with another point, but let Tessa.
All right. Okay, thanks, Gary. All right, Tessa.
Thanks. Sorry, Gary. Firstly, thanks, Taryn. That was really, really beautiful presentation. Also know you as a person and as an artist, and have kind of just been witnessing you developing over the last 2 years, and it's been so yeah, fascinating and beautiful, and I think very courageous of the way that you've developed, and your thought processing and the resilience that you've built through it. So that's been really, really cool to observe. I wanted to ask a couple of things, but firstly, in this process of revisiting and almost this meditative process that you found quite cathartic, where you were speaking about how sitting with the discomfort and not necessarily bypassing these subjects was quite important, and it felt like you were taking accountability in a sense. Do you feel, and maybe Emma actually has insight on this in terms of eco-grief, but do you feel like it was a kind of grieving process, almost like something you had to sit with to fully embody and process for it to actually become a reality before you could start making, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess, you see, I think some of the stuff with and I might belie not having read Emma's work in this, but I guess some of my association with grief is as if it is a singular loss. Whereas like context of looking at your community struggling or South African politics, it's quite a continuum of difficult things. So I think at times I felt like, okay, well, maybe if I start feeling better, then I'll make better work, or you know, maybe I just need to step back for a bit and that kind of thing. But then, yeah, over time, I had to settle into, I don't think I'm gonna feel much better about it. But it's in the, I'm not gonna feel much better, but I want to do things anyway, and I need to keep doing it anyway, that has actually helped me feel better. And I think it's a lot of like the art and artist like dynamic that I've read a lot in different contexts of when you actually feel what you're feeling, then you can create things that are true to that, and then that actually becomes the place of it. So I think the feeling of grief is a parallel and coping with it, but it's also, like you say, I think resilience is some of the acceptance of it's not one loss, it's difficulty that has to be coped with.
Amazing. And then I think it kind of continues from that, and thanks for that. So in terms of the nihilistic period, looking at what came after was absurdism, which acknowledges that life is meaningless, but it encourages actively embracing this conflict and creating subjective meaning. So do you feel like you were moving from a nihilistic point to absurdist?
Well, okay, so I haven't deep dived absurdism, so I think it's like I'm not sure if I can ascribe it as that is where I stand. But the most useful stuff for me has been the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, and she was in the existentialist camp. There's also been good argument that that Nietzsche was a proto-existentialist, because a lot of the existentialist movement was in response to his writings. Similarly with absurdism. So I think that side of things. But I'm careful to say what I subscribe to, because there's aspects of everything that I find little logic problems with. But I think I'm in a place of I'm quite accepting of my nihilistic tendencies, but I've kind of mentally devoted myself to as long as I operate with ethics and try my best to be optimistic about what my life can mean, then it'll be okay.
Okay,
Amazing.
thanks.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Taryn. Sorry to rush us. We are sort of, as I said, edging towards, well, we're over time now, but Gary, I'd like you to just say your thing, whatever it is.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I just wanted to just two observations or two thoughts. The one is in relation to Sisyphus, so in terms of the work, the environmental work, is that you have to sort of detach from outcome in order to be able to do stuff effectively, so that you don't, that you keep going, you do it. But when you walk in nature or somewhere and the degradation is obvious, that means that there's meaning, that it's, otherwise degradation would have no meaning to us. So the collapse of the planet would have no meaning to us, but it does have meaning, so that was the one thing. And then just in terms of Gqeberha, I mean, is it human exceptionalism that we are the only beings on the planet that live with purpose? Do other animals, other creatures not live with purpose? Is that a human distinction? Because if that is, then that's quite a fundamental difference between us and everything else that we share the planet with.
Taryn, you'll have to answer on behalf of Gqeberha.
Yeah, I mean, what I will respond to is with the beach cleanup dynamic is that of like we do cling to that degradation does mean something, that there is something that can be degraded that we have attached to, and even in speaking about that, the absurdist thing of pushing the rock up the hill over and over is similar to cleaning up litter on the beach. is just because it's clean today doesn't mean it'll be clean tomorrow, and neither of which means it was a bad idea to clean it. But it's up to us, so you might have the connotation of, okay, well, degradation is just a human construction, so it doesn't matter if the beach is completely destroyed. Or you can have the response of like, no, actually, I remember being really happy on a clean beach one time, and I would want that for future people. It doesn't matter that it fundamentally means something. It matters that it brought joy. It matters that it helped community. It matters that I care about it. So that's the other way of thinking about that. Yeah, I think that's me.
Okay, thank you, Taryn. That was a good way to end the seminar. Lots and lots and lots of things to think about, huh? As always. So yeah, as Glenn has just made a comment of very rich thinking today. Thanks, Taryn. So he's in the chat, and yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is. It's really just, it's so important if we're thinking about moving into the future. All of these things are kind of buzzing around in our minds. And I'm hoping we'll just keep on continuing this conversation. Remember, we had I think the term, what was it? Necessary optimism with Brian. I think there's a sense in which that is coming through quite a bit. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to end on the necessary optimism note for this weekend. And yeah, wish you all a happy weekend, and thanks again. And we'll see you all next week, I hope. Okay. Cheers.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Taryn.
Thanks.